If you want the fastest, most effective method of changing out the oil filter housing and oil cooler gaskets while making the least amount of mess, you're in the right place. And as a bonus, we're gonna upgrade the system from this to this. What's up everybody, my name is Fritz and welcome to the channel. The oil filter housing gasket is a well-known fail point and issue on most modern day BMWs that typically needs to be replaced around that 40,000-ish mile mark. But because it has such a close relationship with the other gaskets in the area, it's also good to replace the oil cooler gasket as well as the gaskets for those two oil lines in the front while you're doing this. And the reason why we're upgrading to the Mosselman oil thermostat is because it functions as a true thermostat. So we're gonna be able to reach optimal running temperatures the same as before. But because it opens sooner by about 20 degrees, it's gonna be able to send that oil and additional heat down to the oil cooler sooner and help us dissipate that heat better, giving us overall lower running temperatures, which should extend the performance of the car, which is great for those of you who plan to track your car. But it should also give us better longevity out of our oil, coolant, and even the gaskets that we're about to replace. But we're gonna do some real world testing in a daily driven situation towards the end to see if this is all fluff or it actually makes a difference. And although I wouldn't say that you need any specialty tools for this job, tools that are gonna make this a whole lot easier include a few magnetic sockets, as well as a magnetic reach tool. The MVP of this job, in my opinion, is a long double box and 8mm spline drive wrench. And you're also gonna want a torque wrench that goes down to 8 Newton meters. But before we start turning any bolts on the car, the first thing we need to do is open the trunk.
With the trunk liner out, we should find a fuse diagram in our fuse box. Locate fuse 165 and confirm it's for the low pressure fuel pump before removing it. Now turn the car over and allow it to run until all the gas is used up, which takes about 4 minutes. This is pivotal if we are to prime the engine properly and prevent oil starvation. So if you're doing this job along with an oil change, do not skip this step. Now to remove any and all coverings and strut braces blocking access to the air intake, which will also need to be removed. The OEM intake is held in by a sensor, 4 clips at the air filter, and a hose clamp at the opposite side. Since one bolt is tucked behind the intake manifold, we'll have to back it out slightly. In order to do so, we'll need to remove the engine cover and rear foam, revealing the O2 sensors that also need to be disconnected. Pop them off from their bracket, disengage the lock, and lift up the inner tab to accomplish this. On the other side, disconnect the top portion of the charge pipe. This is easier with an aftermarket pipe, as you can remove it completely. But if you have an OEM one, just tuck it underneath so it doesn't prevent the manifold from backing out. Let's also loosen the oil filter cap and allow that oil to drain down into the system. If you're replacing the filter, you can completely remove it now. But to limit the changing variables in our testing, I opted to reuse the filter, which only has a couple thousand miles on it. As that's going on, we'll remove the 11mm nuts and bolts holding in the manifold. And trust me, you want a deep well magnetic socket for this. The first few bolts are easy enough, but the remaining nuts are a different story and can be easily lost if you don't have a magnetic tool. Even then, I would try to secure it into the socket as you remove it. The 7th and final fastener for this section is tucked all the way in the back here. So even with your magnetic tool, be very careful when removing it. Since we'll wait to back off the manifold until we're ready for that bolt, let's cover these openings as we continue to work. At this point, the car should be completely cool. If not, allow it to cool off because we're going to drain the coolant from the auxiliary radiator, which is behind the driver's side bumper. With the wheel removed, undo the 8mm holding in the plastic wheel well liner and remove it. Underneath, we have to remove the corner shield held in by 5 more 8mm and our sensor connection. Bring in your catch and disengage the quick release before wiggling it off. Allow it to drain, and if it slows down like this, loosen the bleed screw and let it flow for 5 seconds before tightening the screw. We don't need to drain it completely, as we're only removing that top coolant hose and don't want any coolant dripping down from there. I ended up draining about 1.5 liters before reattaching the connection, cleaning it off, and locking it in. Since we don't need to come back down here, we can reconnect our sensor, splash shields, and wheel before bringing it down and torquing to 140 Newton meters. Even if you plan on doing this with the coolant flush, as soon as the coolant stops draining, you can put everything back on here, as it's not necessary to come back after the drain. Back to the top, let's unsecure this 10mm supporting the lines in front of the oil thermostat and place down lots of towels in this area to catch any oil that comes out. I used about 25 of the 50 shop rags in just this area alone. It's critical that we don't get any oil on the belt or its pulleys, as it could cause the belt to walk off and get sucked up by the engine. Now we can remove the filter and soak up any leftover oil, and detach that top coolant line, which should be carrying no coolant at all. To keep it out of the way, we'll need to tie it off to the side. We don't want any oil getting in here. Disconnect the 2 front oil lines by unsecuring the T30 and pushing them down. As you see here, this is why we want this many towels, so you can control the oil flow and catch everything that comes out. With a clean cloth, clean the area and absorb that top layer of oil before removing the 2 O-rings. If the 2 O-rings aren't on the lines and they didn't fall out, you'll want to check inside the oil cooler itself. With them out, clean the area again so it's ready to receive the new gaskets, but for now, let's move them out of the way and cover them up. Detach the oil pressure sensor, and now we're ready to pull back the intake manifold. It doesn't need to come off completely, just backed off enough like this, giving us access to this E10. Once it's spun off, use a magnetic tool to retrieve it. The top bolt of the housing is also an E10, just like the bottom, but due to its access, a long 8mm spline drive wrench works best. Honestly, this wrench and the magnetic tool are the MVPs of this job. Trust me, grab these tools if you plan on doing this yourself. I have both of them linked in the description. At a certain point, you'll need to finish it off by hand and lift up on the housing as you do this in order to get that extra clearance. This is exactly why this one comes out last. Place the housing off to the side and let's clean the area. Pick up whatever you can with a rag, and if you need to, spray parts cleaner on a clean section of your rag for those stubborn areas. And in the surrounding areas that are not receiving oil, you can spray parts cleaner directly in there in order to push the oil down and out. One thing I would like to note is that I should have placed some rags in the back here, because some oil did end up spilling over here when we removed the housing. Once it's all clean, let's move over to the table. Here you can see where our leak was, and my original indicator of why the gaskets needed to be replaced. And although it went up in this corner, if we look carefully, we can see that it didn't actually come from the seal of the oil cooler, but from one or both of the 2 lines in front of the oil thermostat. On a good note, we have no signs of leaking from the oil filter housing, but since we were already here, we might as well replace this too, as it should be done around the 40,000 mile mark. Although we're not going to reuse this oil thermostat, we should still clean the area to reduce the risk of contamination before separating the 2 units. which is held in by 3 E12s. Once the two units are separated, go ahead and clean the area in which you couldn't get to before and then remove the gasket. Then clean the grooves with your pick tool covered by a clean rag or towel. And once it looks like this, we can move over to the oil filter housing gasket and do the same thing. And really take your time at this step. The cleaner we get the grooves, the better the gasket will seat and extend its longevity. The attention to detail here could be the difference between doing this job again in a few years or in a few months. Placing on the oil cooler gasket first, we want to apply light, even pressure, allowing the gasket to fall into place with a slight protrusion like this. And it's here that you'll notice that the new oil thermostat is noticeably heavier than the OEM one. Give the Mosselman oil thermostat a quick wipe down before placing it in by its alignment pin. And we did elect to use the 10mm titanium bolts that should thread in without issue. Just snug it down evenly for now and place in the oil filter housing gasket. Doing it in this order will preserve each gasket shape until it meets with its corresponding mating surface, ensuring a good leak-free system. As we bring in the entire unit, let's start at the lowest and shortest bolt first, as it has the least accessibility, followed by the longest bolt at the top, then the medium-sized one behind the intake manifold. With all the bolts threaded in, tighten them all gradually and evenly by hand. As soon as you feel the bolt, pull the housing by a few turns, move on to the next bolt. Here you can actually see how each bolt tilts the housing and why we had to tighten it on this way if we were to get even pressure on the gasket. Once it's all snug, tighten to 22 Newton meters. I started with the one in the back behind the intake manifold first, as it's the hardest to observe a leak there. Then the bottom. However, unless you remove the coolant flange, you can't get a torque wrench on the bottom E10. So with your 8mm spline drive, tighten it with the fixed end, remembering we need just a little less force than what's required at the oil filter cap and finishing at the top. The three 10mm get 16 Newton meters starting from the bottom to the top. Afterwards, place on the new gaskets for your oil lines and reattach them on both ends before reconnecting them, which you should hear it snap in. Our kit also included a new 5mm bolt that once snugged down gets torqued to 8 Newton meters. Reconnect the coolant hose and secure your oil lines with the 10mm before adding some oil to the oil filter housing. Going up to the threads should be enough. If you're doing this with an oil change, go ahead and do this twice before adding in the rest of your 6.9 quarts. And since it takes a long time for the oil to drain here, let's top off and purge the coolant in the meantime. Just fill it with 50/50 blue coolant just below the max line and close it up. Then turn the car on, and with the heat all the way up and the fan at its lowest setting, step on the gas until you hear this sound. By now the oil should have drained, and we can place in our filter after lubricating the O-rings and tighten to 25 Newton meters. Reconnect the oil pressure sensor and slide in the intake manifold. Then thread in the fasteners. Here, just take your time and ensure each fastener is threaded on, but don't secure it all the way down yet. To tighten it evenly, start from the middle and work your way out in an alternating pattern before torquing in that same pattern to 15 Newton meters. We can now reinsert our charge pipe, which should go on without issue. If it can't fit, double check that the manifold is completely pressed in. Once the charge pipe is back on, then reconnect the sensor. Moving to the opposite side, let's reconnect our two O2 sensors, remembering the blue goes in the back, and by now the purge process should be complete and the coolant should be between the min and max line. If not, top it off and purge again. Now check for any leaks, and if you're all good, remove the towels and double check to be sure. At this point, we need to be absolutely sure there's no oil on the belt or any headed in that direction. Then throw back on the foam, engine cover, and air intake, as well as any other covers or strut braces that you had to remove. To prime the engine, turn the car over. It will try to start 3 times. Just let it run its course. If you also did this with an oil change, you can do it a second time to be safe. Afterwards, place back in fuse 165 and the trunk liner before starting the car. As it comes to operating temperature, ensure there are no leaks along all the gaskets we replaced. And since this is a true thermostat, the car reaches operating temperature in the same amount of time as the OEM unit. But the Mosselman thermostat opens 20 degrees sooner to send the oil down to the oil cooler. But how does this work in a real-world daily driven situation? As a quick disclaimer, my meter measures water temperature, not oil. But once operating temperatures are met, water temp is about 9 degrees Celsius lower than oil temp. In my 1-week experience, I did notice that the car took about the same amount of time to reach optimal running temperatures. During normal street driving, I did notice a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius drop, but that could be attributed to the combination of new oil, coolant, and change in ambient temperature along with the oil thermostat. The big difference could be seen at cruising freeway speeds. Even when compared to nighttime driving, the OEM thermostat would hold at about the low 90s to just below 110 degrees Celsius. But even in the middle of the day, if the car was cruising long enough, the temps with the Mosselman thermostat could drop down to the high 60s, which, to their credit, is even slightly better than their advertised range. And these results were very consistent so long as the conditions were more or less the same, that being the Mosselman oil thermostat plus prolonged airflow to the oil cooler, yielding lower overall running temperatures by about 20 degrees Celsius.
So based off of our testing, I would say that this is a worthwhile modification for anybody who sees a lot of free-flowing traffic, whether it be on the track or on the freeway. Even if you're somebody who sees frequent stop-and-go traffic and you don't work on your car, but you also plan to keep your car for a while, this may be a mod that you want to consider, because if this can extend the life of those gaskets and turn 3 gasket replacements into 2, you may be actually saving money by not having to take it to your mechanic that additional time. The only group of people that I would say might not see the most benefit by going to this oil thermostat are going to be those of you who are hardcore DIYers and spend a lot of time in stop and go traffic. You may never even reach the conditions where this truly benefits you. So the most cost-effective thing for you is to simply replace the gaskets and keep the OEM unit. And now that we've addressed this common issue, as well as all of the other gaskets and leaks in this area, you want to make sure that belt that we talked about earlier never slips off, gets sucked into the engine, and causes complete failure. To make sure that never happens, check out the video right over here, and I'll see you in that one.